Nah. The moment he raised his champagne glass and smiled at the crowd, I saw his hand tremble. Just slightly. Just enough for me to know he recognized me. 300 people in that ballroom had no idea what was about to happen. But Raymond Holt knew, and watching the color drain from his face was worth every single year I had waited. Let me take you back to the beginning. I was 31 years old when my husband died. Daniel was a structural engineer, the kind of man who triple-checked everything: bridge load calculations, foundation specs, the pressure seals on industrial ventilation shafts. He used to say that in his line of work, careless was another word for criminal. He believed that down to his bones. It was one of the reasons I loved him. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, inside a collapsed utility corridor at the Holt-Mercer construction site outside of Dayton, Ohio. The official report said equipment failure, unexpected structural compromise, an accident. I knew it wasn't an accident, but I was 31, and I had a 4-year-old son named Thomas, and I had $1,400 in our checking account, and I had a grief so heavy I could barely lift myself off the bathroom floor most mornings. So I took the settlement Raymond Holt's company offered, $80,000 in a non-disclosure agreement, because I didn't know what else to do. Because the lawyer they sent to my kitchen table spoke in a calm, reasonable voice and told me I had no case. Because I was alone and exhausted and terrified, I signed the paper. I told myself I had no choice, and for 27 years I carried that like a stone in my chest. I raised Thomas by myself in a 2-bedroom apartment in Kettering. I worked as a medical billing specialist at a regional hospital, steady hours, decent insurance, the kind of job that doesn't make anyone's eyes light up at a dinner party but pays the electric bill without fail. I packed lunches and attended school plays and sat in the bleachers at every single one of Thomas's cross-country meets, even the ones in November when I couldn't feel my fingers. I helped him apply to colleges, filled out the financial aid forms myself, drove him to Ohio State with his boxes and his secondhand desk lamp, and cried the whole way home. I never told him what happened to his father. I told myself I was protecting him. I told myself there was no point reopening something that couldn't be changed. What I didn't admit to myself for a very long time was that part of me was also protecting my own shame. The shame of having signed that paper, of having taken that money, of having let Raymond Holt walk away clean. Thomas built a good life. He got his MBA, moved to Columbus, started working at a mid-sized logistics firm. He was sharp and hardworking and had his father's way of paying close attention to things. I was proud of him every day. Then he met a young woman named Cassie, and within a year, he called to tell me he was going to propose. I was so happy I started crying before he even finished the sentence. Cassie was warm and funny and practical in the best way. She had a laugh that filled a room. I liked her from the very first Sunday dinner she came to. The way she helped clear the table without being asked. The way she argued with Thomas about a documentary they'd watched and held her ground completely. I thought, yes, this one is right for him. I asked about her family once, casually. She mentioned her father ran a construction and development company based out of Columbus. Big projects, she said. Her dad had built his business from scratch. She was proud of him. I didn't ask the name of the company. I should have asked. 3 weeks before the wedding, Cassie's mother called to discuss seating arrangements. We were being polite and friendly with each other, building the tentative warmth of 2 women whose children were about to merge their lives. She mentioned her husband's name in passing, Raymond Holt. She said it the way you say something that means nothing, because to her it meant nothing. I set the phone down on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a long time. My son was marrying the daughter of the man who had killed his father. I want to tell you that I handled that moment with grace. I want to tell you I knew immediately what to do. But the truth is, I sat down on my kitchen floor, the same floor I had sat on 27 years earlier when the policeman came to the door, and I felt something crack open inside me that I had spent decades keeping sealed shut. I did not call Thomas. I did not call Cassie. I did not call anyone. What I did in the weeks that followed was think very carefully. I had spent 27 years believing there was nothing I could do. I had believed a lawyer who worked for Raymond Holt's insurance company. I had believed that my grief made me weak, that my silence was inevitable. But I was not 31 anymore. I was 63 years old. I had spent 3 decades watching, reading, paying attention to the world. And I had one thing I hadn't had before: time and the clarity that comes from it. I contacted a woman named Patricia Ossie, a workplace safety attorney in Cincinnati whose name I had come across years ago in a local news article about a mining accident case. I drove to her office on a Wednesday morning and I told her everything: the non-disclosure agreement, the settlement, the official report that said equipment failure, the fact that 2 other workers had been injured in that same corridor 6 weeks before Daniel died, and that Holt Mercer had continued operations without completing the required repairs. I knew about those prior injuries because Daniel had told me. He'd been worried. He'd written it down in his work journal: dates, names, the conversation he'd had with the site supervisor who told him the repairs were scheduled but not yet done. I still had the journal. I had kept it in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet for 27 years because I could not bring myself to throw away his handwriting. Patricia looked at the journal for a long time. Then she looked at me. She told me the NDA likely couldn't prevent me from cooperating with a regulatory investigation, only from pursuing my own civil suit. She told me that if there'd been prior documented incidents and Holt Mercer had concealed them from the original investigation, there could be grounds for a criminal referral to the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation Fraud Division. She told me it was a long road and she couldn't promise outcomes. I told her I had been walking a long road for 27 years and I was very good at it by now. We began meeting regularly. Patricia filed information requests. I sat in her office going through documents, my reading glasses on, a yellow legal pad on my knee. Learning the vocabulary of a fight I should have had the resources to pick decades ago. We found the original incident reports from those 2 prior injuries. We found a safety audit from 2 months before Daniel died that had flagged the ventilation corridor as a priority repair, an audit that had never been submitted to the state. Someone had kept it internal. Someone had made a decision. I will not pretend those months were easy. I was preparing for my son's wedding at the same time. I was picking out a dress and ordering a cake topper and writing a toast that I rewrote 11 times. And underneath all of it, I was carrying this enormous thing that I had not yet told Thomas about. I went back and forth about whether to tell him before the wedding. Some nights I was certain I had to. He deserved to know. He was about to become this man's son-in-law, about to bring his children someday into a family built on something terrible. Other nights I thought about Cassie, who loved her father, who was innocent in all of this, whose wedding day did not deserve to become a crime scene. In the end, what decided it for me was Raymond Holt himself. At the rehearsal dinner held at a steakhouse in downtown Columbus, he gave a toast. He was a big man, well-dressed, used to commanding rooms. He talked about his daughter and his new son-in-law with genuine affection. He talked about family and legacy and building something that lasts. He was charming and polished, and the whole room was smiling. Then he looked down the table at me. Thomas had introduced us briefly, just names, no history, and he said, with a kind of casual ease that told me he had no idea who I was, and of course, a special welcome to Thomas's mother, joining our family from, where was it? Dayton? And he smiled at me like I was a pleasant footnote. Something settled in me right then, quiet and cold and absolute. Kettering, I said. I've been in Kettering for 30 years, since my husband died. He nodded pleasantly and moved on. He did not remember me. I had been a signature on a piece of paper, a problem that had been made to go away. The wedding was held on a Saturday in May at an estate venue outside Columbus with a reception ballroom that held 300 guests easily. It was a beautiful day. Cassie looked extraordinary. Thomas cried when he saw her at the end of the aisle, which made me cry, which made the woman next to me cry. A chain reaction of entirely deserved emotion. I sat in the second row, not the first. The seating arrangement had placed both sets of parents at the head table, and I was fine with that. I was fine with all of it. I had spent 30 years being fine with arrangements made by other people. I had a folder in my car. Patricia and I had discussed this carefully. She had advised me that the appropriate path was the regulatory one, and I agreed. But I also knew that Raymond Holt had spent 27 years believing he was untouchable, that the people in his life believed he was a self-made man of integrity, his business partners, his friends, his daughter, his new son-in-law. My son. I had talked to Thomas 2 nights before the wedding. I told him I needed to tell him something about his father, about how his father had really died. I told him everything. The journal, the prior incidents, the suppressed audit, the NDA, the $80,000, the attorney. I watched his face go through things I cannot fully describe. Anger. Grief that looked very much like the grief of a 4-year-old boy who never really got to process losing his father. A long silence. Then he asked me, "What do you need from me?" That was his father's son, right there. I told him I wasn't going to blow up his wedding. I told him I was going to let the legal process do what it was going to do. But I told him there was one moment I needed, and I asked him if he trusted me. He said yes without hesitating. The reception toasts happened after dinner. Raymond Holt stood up first. Of course he did. That was the kind of man he was. And he gave a long, warm, well-rehearsed speech about Cassie and Thomas in the future. He talked about hard work and family values and the importance of honesty. He raised his glass. The chandelier light caught the crystal and scattered little points of light across the ceiling. And that was when he looked out at the room and his eyes found mine, and he finally recognized me. I watched it happen. The slight adjustment of his expression, the moment his brain connected the name, Kettering, the mention of a dead husband, the woman sitting in this room watching him with quiet attention. I watched him try to maintain his smile and almost manage it. I stood up. 300 people watched me stand. Thomas's hand under the table found Cassie's. Cassie looked confused. I had a piece of paper in my hand. Not the full file, just one page. The one that mattered most. The internal safety audit from 2001, with the ventilation corridor flagged in red, with a handwritten notation in the margin from a site supervisor that said, "Hold for now, RH aware." I didn't shout. I didn't perform. I was 63 years old and I had been waiting for this for a very long time, and I had no interest in drama for its own sake. I spoke clearly, the way you speak when you have thought carefully about every word. I said, I'd like to say something about legacy, since that's what tonight is really about. Raymond had gone very still. I said my husband Daniel worked for Holt Mercer Construction. He died in October of 2001 in a structural collapse that was ruled an accident. He was 33 years old. Thomas was 4. I paused. What was not public knowledge is that 6 weeks before my husband died, 2 other workers were injured in the same corridor. A safety audit flagged it as a priority repair. That audit was never filed with the state. My husband kept a journal. He wrote down his concerns. He wrote down the conversation where he was told repairs were coming. The room was absolutely silent. I held up the page. This document is one of several now in the hands of the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. A formal investigation was opened 11 days ago. I looked at Raymond Holt. His champagne glass was still raised. His arms seemed to have forgotten to lower it. "My son is marrying your daughter," I said. "I want to be honest with this family. I want Thomas to know who his father was and what happened to him. And I want to be clear that what I am doing through the proper legal channels, not to harm Cassie, who is innocent and who I already love, but because my husband deserved better than silence, and so did my son." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Thomas stood up. He walked the length of the head table, came around to where I was sitting and put his arms around me from behind the way he used to do as a little boy, his chin on the top of my head. He said, into my hair, "Hi, Mom." That was all. That was everything. Cassie cried. She left the room with her mother for a while. Raymond Holt sat back down in his chair and did not speak again for the rest of the evening. I heard later from Patricia that his attorney called her office first thing Monday morning to discuss the parameters of the investigation and Raymond's options for cooperation. His empire, built on 30 years of confident untouchability, had just become very complicated. The weeks after the wedding were hard in ways I had expected and ways I hadn't. Cassie was devastated, not disbelieving, which mattered, but devastated. She had loved her father with the uncomplicated love of a child who never had reason to look closely. Learning to love him with full knowledge of what he was capable of was something she would have to work through on her own timeline, and I told her I understood that. I told her that none of this changed how I felt about her, or what she meant to my son, or what she meant to me. She called me 2 weeks after the wedding. She said, "I need you to know that I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. I'm not going to protect him from consequences." Then she said, "I'm glad you stood up. I'm glad Thomas has a mother like you." I held the phone against my chest for a while after I hung up. Thomas came to Kettering the following Sunday. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed that NDA 27 years ago, and I showed him his father's journal. He read it slowly, all of it, touching the pages like they were something fragile. When he was done, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "He sounds like someone I would have liked." I said, "You would have loved him, and he would have been so proud of you." We ordered pizza and stayed at that table until after midnight, and I told Thomas everything about his father that I had been saving for years without realizing it. The way Daniel laughed, the way he made coffee too strong and didn't understand why anyone would drink it any other way. The cross-country road trip we took before Thomas was born, all the way to New Mexico, sleeping in the car half the time because we couldn't afford motels. The journal he kept, his habit of checking things twice, his belief that careless was another word for criminal. The investigation moved slowly, the way these things do. Raymond Holt hired a very expensive legal team. There were depositions and delays and moments where Patricia called me to explain that the process was going to take longer than either of us hoped. I had waited 27 years. I could wait a little more. I went back to Kettering. I went back to my apartment, my routines, my morning walks in the neighborhood where I had raised my son, past the school where he learned to read, and the park where I pushed him on the swings on Sunday afternoons. I was the same person I had been before all of this. I was also completely different. I started leaving a small light on in the kitchen at night. I'm not sure why. It just felt right to have a lit window instead of a dark one. Thomas called every Sunday. Cassie joined sometimes. They were building something real, the two of them, something that had roots deep enough to survive a hard beginning. I wasn't worried about them. One Sunday in September, Thomas told me they were expecting a baby. I was going to be a grandmother. I put the phone down and walked to the kitchen window and stood there for a long time looking out at the street. Your grandfather was a man who checked things twice, I thought. I'm going to tell you everything about him. Daniel, this one's for you.